You know, it's funny. The last time I saw this newspaper was in the Soviet Union. I picked it up in 1988. This is Pravda, and this was the only news that you could get back in the Soviet Union back then. I would have never thought that one day I would be using this very newspaper, Pravda, to test out the new Viltrox 33mm lens. If that's not a first for YouTube, I don't know what is. Roll that intro. Hi everyone, welcome to Pal to Tech. Well, they are at it again. Viltrox just released their new 33mm f1.4 autofocus lens for Fujifilm's X-mount. Viltrox was kind enough to send us a copy of this lens to test out and review. But just like always, this review is completely unbiased. I'm not being paid by Viltrox to do this review. The price for this 35mm lens is approximately $270 US as of the date of this video. Let's go over what you get for that, how it performs, my overall impressions of it, and some issues with it that I do want to discuss. Much like their other lenses, their packaging is solid and well designed. You get a brief MTF graph pamphlet together with a usual gray lens bag with the Viltrox logo on it, and of course the lens itself. The first thing I noticed right away was that they upgraded to a metal lens hood. I love this thing, and man, it just connects on so smoothly and perfectly. It fits better than any lens hood that I have ever owned. It's just wonderful. There was no weather sealing that I was able to notice on the lens, and the front of the lens will take a 52mm size filter. The focusing ring is nice and smooth, and it turns very, very well. No complaints there. I found its focus motor to be quiet and smooth for the most part. The aperture ring is stepless, meaning it doesn't click when you turn it. It just smoothly turns silently. The aperture ring does click into place once you get to the automatic setting right here. The lens itself is much lighter than the 85mm, and it weighs only 270 grams, or a little bit over 1/2 of a pound. The reason for this is that the 33mm is an APS-C lens, so by keeping this lens to an APS-C only, Viltrox was able to keep the weight down considerably. It utilizes a fully electronic connection to the camera, which of course gives the camera full control over autofocus and aperture adjustments. It has a USB port located right on the lens itself, which you can easily connect to your computer to upgrade the firmware. For this review, I am using the latest firmware that the lens has available as of right now, which is version 1.0. While reviewing and shooting with this lens, I performed a number of tests in comparison with my other lens. That's the Fujifilm 35mm f2.0. Keep in mind, however, that although these two lenses are very similar, the Fujifilm 35mm 2.0 is about $130 more expensive than this Viltrox 33mm f1.4. Overall, I love the image quality from this lens, and I think you get a good value for the price of this lens. I found the colors overall to be a bit on the cooler side, and one thing you should consider is that the minimum focus distance on this lens is further than the 35mm Fuji. In fact, I measured the minimum focus distance on the Viltrox to be about 15 inches, or 38 centimeters minimum focus distance. And as a comparison, on the 35mm lens from Fuji, you do need to be further away with the Viltrox. As I was out shooting, one of the things that struck me was that having the 33mm focal length versus the 35, I actually found the 33 to be a better fit for me. I often had to kind of step back a bit with the 35, but with the 33 Viltrox, that seemed to be a kind of a magic number for me for the 50mm equivalent all-around lens. Stop down to f16, we can see blurriness in the corners as to be expected. As we open up the lens one stop to f11, it improves and continues to improve with a nice sharpness at the f8 and f5.6 range. As far as the center goes, at widest aperture of f1.4, there is a distinct blurriness in the center. It's still mostly there at f2, and it's completely gone by f2.8. On the other hand, at f16, I do notice that the center is a bit soft, but not as noticeable as it is at f1.4. Overall, I found the bokeh very pleasing, especially with lights indoors. Once I took it outside, I found the background with the vegetation to be a little bit on the busier side. However, I also found the subject isolation to be very nice for this lens, particularly for the price point you're paying for it. And when I tested it with the 35mm, have a look at this. Both of these images were taken at f2.0. The image on the left is the Viltrox. The image on the right is the Fujifilm 35mm f2.0. The bokeh balls are a little bit softer on Fuji, no doubt. Here's another comparison between the Viltrox 33mm on the right and the Fuji 35mm on the left, both of them at f2.0. Both of them quite similar, although I do notice a little bit of chromatic aberration right here in the red. See that? Again, I'm zoomed in at 200%. When I back out, they look identical. Let's use the Pravda Soviet newspaper, shall we? Okay, both these images were shot with the 33mm. Okay, the image on the left is f1.4, the image on the right is f2.0. And as I zoom in, you can clearly see it right here, no doubt about it, at f1.4. Okay, let's take another look. There is purple fringing right here along the sides that goes away when it's changed to f2.0. If I switch to f4, as you can see, it's gone completely. I'd like to talk about autofocus now because that is a big feature of the Viltrox lens with Fujifilm. I tested this lens with 3 different scenarios. For this first shot, I used f2.8 on continuous autofocus. I had the mouse droid moving toward me, which is awesome, by the way, and it nailed the focus just fine. Next, I had a bicycle rider going across. Not too bad. It nailed most of the shots. Another one, she's coming directly at me, and I noticed that it performs better with side motion than it did with the subject coming directly at the lens. Next, I did face-eye auto detect. So it worked, right? And I gotta tell you, face-eye auto detect, no matter what we did to try and fake it out, face-eye auto detect worked wonderfully on this lens. It works great. As I mentioned earlier, I love having an aperture ring on a lens for a Fujifilm camera. I mean, come on, the 90mm, love this lens, fast and razor sharp, but that aperture ring, click, 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 right? Loud. Not so with the Viltrox. Shh, quiet. However, this aperture ring can be a double-edged sword. For third-party lenses, such as this Rokinon 35mm cinema lens, the stepless aperture ring, it's completely disconnected from the camera, and it changes smoothly, so it's letting in light very smoothly. It's not stepping through the various aperture blades. On the other hand, you'll have a Fuji lens, right? And this is connected electronically. It has an aperture ring that when you turn it, sends the signal to the camera, and turning the aperture ring on a lens like the 90mm results in an almost instantaneous refresh of what you see through the viewfinder or on the back of the LCD screen. The Viltrox lens sits sort of in the middle. It does have an aperture ring, which I absolutely love. And because this lens is a third-party lens, and the fact that it is connected electronically to the camera, there were 3 distinct issues I noticed with regard to the synchronization of the aperture ring to the camera. The first has to do with a very interesting way the aperture would jump after you would play back a photo that you had just taken, and when you went to switch back, to the regular camera mode to take another shot, the aperture would just magically change. Take a look at this. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it back, turn it this way, boom. It's all the way over to f1.4. See that? Okay, now I take the picture, then I play back the picture by pressing that button. Okay, there it is. As you can see, the aperture is still f1.4. I'm playing back the picture I just took, Now I am lightly pressing the shutter to get me back to where I was, and look at that. It's switched to f1.6. Even though it's f1.4, it jumps back to and now it just switched to f1.8. So it's all over the place. The second issue I noticed was when I was turning the aperture ring while the other settings on the camera were in manual. So for example, I set manual ISO, manual shutter speed, and then I rotated the aperture ring to change the exposure by either opening or closing down the lens. Have a look at what happened. So here's the same settings. I put it on 400 ISO, 125 shutter speed. I'm now going to turn the aperture ring. See that? Now, keep in mind, when I actually went to take the picture, it was the correct aperture. So this was more of an annoyance than anything else. But for me, it was jarring to look through the viewfinder as I'm rotating the aperture ring and have it go bright, dark, bright, dark, bright, dark. It was just a little bit off, you know, and it doesn't do this, for example, with the 90mm when you rotate the aperture ring. And I do believe that this issue could be resolved with a firmware update. Again, more of an annoyance than really something that actually affects the picture. The last issue I noticed had to do with video shooting. When you're shooting video, you're generally not going to be drastically changing your aperture up and down if you can avoid it. You know, it'd be better to add or remove light. But if you want to change aperture on the fly, you do have this awesome stepless aperture ring that's supposed to be very quiet, which is a real benefit for video. However, when I had set my shutter speed to manual, my ISO to manual, I was in video mode and I was turning the aperture ring. Have a look at this. You see that? You see how the light kind of just jumps. It doesn't go smoothly up and down. It does act like the 90mm, but I thought with the stepless aperture ring that it would act more like a completely manual lens and give you that smooth change. And it doesn't do that. The reason it's behaving this way is because, as I mentioned earlier, this lens sort of straddles the middle between an all-manual third-party lens and a fully native electronically controlled Fujifilm lens. And while I think it's wonderful that the Viltrox 35mm lens is electronically connected to and talking with the camera, I do think that there is room for improvement in the conversation that the two of them are having. The final issue I want to mention, I actually didn't experience. However, it was reported on the YouTube channel Andrew and Danae, and it has to do with the Viltrox lens causing a delay in switching exposure during burst mode. If you haven't seen the video yet, I'll have a link to it down below, and Andrew discusses it toward the end of his video. Just to be clear though, in all the testing I did not experience that exposure delay issue that Andrew reported. However, I am mentioning it to you here because Viltrox themselves actually commented on his video about that issue and mentioned that they're gonna put a fix in place in the next firmware update. So make sure you check out that video if you're considering purchasing this lens and rely on burst mode for the type of shooting that you do. Before I give my conclusion on this lens, I want to say how incredibly important it is for third-party companies like Viltrox to be offering this new breed of lenses that can connect to the Fujifilm camera electronically and utilize autofocus, aperture ring adjustments, and other features previously only possible with official Fujifilm lenses. It goes without saying that competition in this space is a good thing, and it will push innovation and keep the prices down. Now, all of that being said, let's discuss whether or not you should purchase this lens. First of all, if you own an X Pro 3, Do not purchase this lens. There was an announcement today from Viltrox that this lens could damage the camera's lens release button located right next to the mount. Again, this only affects the X Pro 3, and this information I'm telling you right now is as current as the date of this video. If you already own the Fujifilm 35mm f2.0 or the f1.4, I don't think you need to rush out and add the Viltrox to your gear in addition to those lenses. If you are a casual or hobbyist shooter on a budget and you want to get into a prime lens of this focal range, then I think the price of this lens is value for the money. This lens is fast, the autofocus works great, the color rendition and image quality for the price is impressive, and I think the build quality is very, very nice. This is a wonderful little lens that I really enjoy using and plan on using a lot more. And if you don't fit into any of the categories I just mentioned, or if you still aren't sure, consider this. While I do think that this lens is a great option for the under $300 price point, I recommend that you consider waiting to see if the next Viltrox firmware update addresses some of these issues. Viltrox is watching my videos. I know they're watching Andrew's, and they are clearly involved with getting photographer feedback. I have no doubt about that. And I have no doubt that they will get a firmware update released soon enough. Once I'm notified that a firmware update has been released, I will retest these issues on this lens and report those findings to you in a follow-up video. And there is nothing that would make me happier than a 1.01 firmware update to smooth out some of those issues that I mentioned to you today. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope that you found it helpful. If you did, please give it the like and subscribe, and I will see you again in another video very soon. I promise. Take care. By the way, if there's anybody watching this video from Russia, let me know what you think of this newspaper. I can't even read it, but it's really cool. I actually have a bunch of these and other things that I picked up along my travels. Hey, incredible piece of history. Okay, bye-bye.